to Innsmouth, stranger.
Hello friends and welcome to Innsmouth, and if you'd like to follow me into Tim's Olde Book Shoppe, welcome to our 57th excursion into Innsmouth. How's it going, Tim?
It's all right, yeah. Well, we were supposed to be going to the graveyard, weren't we? We got all bundled up in our hats and coats, but I've received this missive. It was stuck under the door from a concerned party, and it was basically, stay away from the graveyard, there's ghouls about.
Ah, right, yes. As you may remember, we were due to be speaking about English ghost stories today, weren't we? And we thought, what better surrounding than the cemetery, but, well, we don't want to be hanging around if there's a ghoul infestation. I mean, the rats are bad enough, but we can sort of cope with those.
Yeah. As long as you don't do any grave robbing, you're all right with the rats, aren't you? But ghouls, nah, I'm out. Yeah, it's also festival, isn't it? So all the strange old folk are reappearing, and
yeah, the streets are teeming outside. I have to say that the town square, there's a big sort of procession walking up the hill to the church. So all our people need to just be aware. Don't join in that procession. As we always say on our trips to Innsmouth, stick close to us, don't wander off in the fog, and especially don't go down any steps to underground subterranean lakes.
Yeah, definitely not. And if you hear leathery wings beating, run. Basically, just leg it.
It's the thought of leathery wings. There's something, I mean, not just wings, but leathery wings.
It is good. I mean, it's evocative, isn't it? Because, I mean, everybody's had a leather jacket and done the flap thing with it, you know? So you know what it sounds like, don't you?
All right. So what we thought we'd do today instead is look at an author who we've mentioned a lot and was a huge influence, well, not just on Lovecraft, but on weird fiction and horror fiction in general. And in fact, he was also well known in his day for writing war fiction as well, war stories.
Yeah.
And was quite a prominent journalist. And that is Ambrose Bierce.
Indeed, yeah. We'll be looking at his story, The Damned Thing, which is one of his classics, one of his most influential. I think it is one of them stories that you can see threads from it going everywhere, pretty much.
Yeah.
I think the blurb on the book that I'm going for, which is a wonderful annotated collection of his horror stories, The Damned Thing and Other Horrors from Old Style Tales, I think this sums him up nicely. He was the successor of Edgar Allan Poe and a harbinger of H.P. Lovecraft.
Yes, very, very true. He sits almost exactly between the two, doesn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, sort of chronologically and style-wise as well.
Yes. Yeah.
And in fact, Lovecraft described his stories as grim and savage, and they're certainly full of that sort of grim humour we've mentioned with certain authors. And of course, a lot of his work, particularly his journalism, was full of sort of social criticism and satire, and is probably most widely known for the Devil's Dictionary.
Oh yeah.
Which is excellent, and again very satirical and very biting in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, even this story has some really big digs at society in it. You know, he was well known for being basically a curmudgeonly old bugger. It's like when you hear Samuel Loveman and Clark Ashton Smith talking about him in the letters between the two, they're always talking about, oh, we wish he was here to talk about this. Wish he was here to talk about this publisher or this person.
And I think it's interesting. You can almost see that each of the big name sort of weird tales authors took a little bit from Bierce in different ways. I mean, with Smith, we get that satire and sharp observation in a lot of his stories. Even the stories that are set on far distant planets, as we talk about in Strange Shadows, often have that satirical aspect about our society to them.
Yeah.
And as we said, Lovecraft said grim and savage, and I think I'm right in saying that Bierce was not a particularly religious person in that sense. Well, he was actually born of Puritan stock. I found out he was born in 1842 in Ohio, of English ancestry, so his ancestors were actually Puritans. but it's something he wrote about and was quite scathing about.
Right.
So I guess for that time that was a little bit unusual to be so anti-religious, perhaps. But that's obviously a Lovecraft characteristic as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of it as well, because obviously he was a military man. He served in the Civil War and things like that. So yeah, I guess that kind of kicked the god out of him, for want of a better term.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. And there are people who still say, I think the occurrence at Owl Creek, for example, is still often held up as one of the finest anti-war stories.
Yeah.
In that sense, something that really depicts the horrors of war, which, yeah, like you say, he had first-hand experience of. In fact, he sustained a head injury in 1864, which eventually got him discharged from the army.
Right.
And due to that, he actually suffered fainting fits throughout the rest of his life because of that injury. And I think also, just going back to the idea of influencing these authors, Bierce came up with Hastur, Halley and Carcosa, which of course were then picked up by
Chambers and then Lovecraft. Yeah.
Mr. Chambers.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting how one person can influence these writers in slightly different ways, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest influence on Lovecraft was the stylistic approach, because as you mentioned, Bierce was a journalist. So a lot of his stuff is done in a very journalistic manner.
Yeah.
And this story, especially, is pretty much how Lovecraft does his stories, you know.
Yes, of course, yeah, the diary. And
the diary, the epistolary
yeah.
sort of mechanic. Yeah, I mean, it is very much what Lovecraft does. And most of Smith's stuff is done in that manner. It's like a second-hand tale, if you know what I mean. Almost like Emma James did it similarly. He's like telling a story of this guy I was talking to told me about this kind of thing.
So yes, a very influential writer, and I think his works have been adapted for TV and film, I think, over 50 times, which maybe we'll talk a little bit about at the end, some of those adaptations.
Yeah.
Okay, so The Damned Thing. This was first published in Town Topics on December the 7th, 1893. Now, that was a New York magazine. And
Journal of Society.
Yes, and it was primarily a scandal mag. It sounds a bit like sort of the News of the World thing of its time.
Yeah. Well, I got it as like Heat magazine, like the Victorian Heat magazine.
Victorian Heat for the tweed-wearing chap about town.
Exactly.
Yeah, because we're not quite into the era of sort of saucy towels and that, or spicy towels, are we? And things are still a little bit restrained. But apparently it carried stories of like who was having an affair with whom, and it slightly changed the names so they couldn't get sued. And it actually led to people getting divorced and all this kind of thing as well.
Oh, that's hilarious.
So, yeah, quite
so
a scandal.
You pick it up to read about somebody having rumpy with their gardener, and you flick the page and you've got the damned thing.
Yeah, but then I was thinking like Playboy magazine, isn't it? You know, which is obviously what it is, centerfolds and all that. But I had people like Robert Anton Wilson writing for it. And
Stephen King,
yeah. So, you know, I guess we're back to that thing, a writer's got to make a living.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, you could get something published. I mean, I've had some things published in some weird places, but you know, you do, don't you? I mean, it's like it's a sale at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so the story starts in a log cabin, and we have a group of men standing around a dead body.
Indeed, I love this basically because it's split up into 4 chapters, and the headings of these chapters are hilarious if you look at them, because this one is "One does not always eat what is on the table."
That's nice.
Because there's a corpse on the table.
Corpse laid out.
Yeah.
A covered corpse, we should say at the moment. It's got the sheet over it.
Yeah, I mean, right from the start, you get the lovely atmosphere, which is something, again, I mean, you can see reading it, there is a lot of similarities to the way Lovecraft sets his scenes as well. You got by the light of a tallow candle, which had been placed on one end of a rough table, a man was reading something written in a book.
And we learn that the deceased on the table, in fact, the owner of the cabin, is one Hugh Morgan. And the only other named character is his friend and associate, William Harker.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so this was written in 1893, and of course, as soon as I hear the name Harker in the Victorian concept, I was thinking Dracula. Whether there's any connection there or anything, I don't know.
Ah, yes, of course. Yeah.
And the only other character who really has a speaking part is the coroner, who is not named.
No.
And obviously there's an investigation going on into Hugh Morgan's death.
Yeah.
And what happened to him.
Yes, they've got all these local farmers and basically, you know, the typical inquest of the time. They were mostly held either in the house of the deceased or in a pub. I did some research on one of the Brighton trunk murders.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, the inquest was held at a boozer that I used to drink in.
Nice.
So, yeah.
Nice. Do they say we don't serve spirits in here?
Hey.
And there's a line in this that I really loved because it, as you say, it sets the scene really nicely, and there's this tension, and everyone's. You can picture the people by the sort of candlelight or lantern light leaning in, and there's a sort of a murmur around the room of what's happened. And the dead man only was without expectation. I thought that was a really nice line.
Yeah, you've got everything here in the atmosphere set up. You've got the long nameless note of a distant coyote, the stilly pulsing trill of tireless insects in trees, strange cries of night birds, so different from those of the birds of day, and the drone of great blundering beetles.
Great blundering beetles. That's like a sort of oath, isn't it? Great blundering beetles, Batman.
Yeah. That's precisely what I thought. I love it. Yeah.
And we learn that Harker is a writer as well. So again, this is something that we see a lot later on with Smith and Lovecraft. The characters are invariably writers or poets.
Yeah.
That cipher type idea again.
Exactly. Yeah, so they're doing the inquest and they've been waiting for Harker because he's been running late. Where's he been coming from? San Francisco, I think. But yeah.
Which was where Bierce lived for a while.
Yes.
And already we get this sort of tension between Harker and the coroner. There's a little bit of sparring going on between them, isn't there?
Yeah, definitely. There's a wonderful bit of dialogue when Harker says that he's a writer. And he says, I sometimes write stories. And the coroner replies, I sometimes read them. Harker says, thank you. And he goes, stories in general, not yours.
It's like,
snarkiness. I love it. It's like, ooh.
And I like this one as well. Age 27. You knew the deceased Hugh Morgan? Yes. You were with him when he died. Near him.
Yeah.
So that was a nice distinction, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And what we basically learn is this pair have been on a hunting trip, shooting and fishing. Although part of the reason for Harker being there was to study Morgan, and we take it this guy's got what's described as an odd solitary way of life.
Yes.
And he thought this might be a good model for a character for one of his stories. So this is almost Bierce being himself, isn't it, in a way?
Yeah.
And perhaps he got the idea for this character from someone in real life.
Yeah. It's again, it's like what Lovecraft does. Basically, most of his characters are himself, aren't they? And you've got, these kind of ciphers going on. And I like the fact that it's not really mentioned what the coroner's reading at this point. But you've been sitting there flipping through this tome with a grave expression, and then, keeps quiet about it, which is quite an important thing.
Yes, yeah. So that gets us into the second chapter, and this is where we get Harker recounting the series of events, beginning with them leaving the house at sunup, and they're out looking for quail, and they've each got a shotgun and one dog. There was just a word that came up here, chaparral, which everyone's familiar with from the High Chaparral, probably.
High Chaparral, yeah.
But I suddenly thought when I saw that, well, what is a chaparral? I think in my mind, because of High Chaparral, I thought it was perhaps a type of house or something. But it actually refers to scrubland. That's all it means, yes. A particular type of scrubland, particularly in California.
Yeah, on the Pacific coast, often dry, rocky and bleak, home to few trees and many desert-like animals.
Yeah. So that sets our scene very nicely. It's very easy to picture that, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I suppose if a monster is going to live somewhere, well, I suppose we can get onto Bigfoot kind of comparisons and that sort of thing. It's going to live in a bleak area, isn't it? It's not going to be living on the edge of town. And almost straight into this, we get the sense of something odd happening, because Morgan seems a little bit jumpy, and even a sort of noise in the bushes sets him off.
Mm-hmm.
And Harker picks up on this and asks him what it is, and Morgan replies without turning his head, "That damned thing." So this is something he's encountered before, as we find out later on.
Yeah, because they initially Harker initially thinks it's a deer, doesn't he? And they've been hunting quail, so they've only got bird shot. So he makes a point of saying, "I wish I'd brought a rifle," you know. So it wouldn't have done them any good if he had, though. To be fair, would it?
It never does, does it?
No.
Dynamite's the only thing that works.
Yeah.
And it kind of reminded me a little bit of the Willows.
Yes.
This part where we get the trees and there's small trees there. It's not like a forest, as we said, but the bushes and the shrubbery and the undergrowth is all moving, and some of it looks like it's even being flattened. Yeah,
I thought that was a nice comparison when I was reading it. I was expect this passage here is very much like the Willows. It's like, you know, it's again, but it's got that same quality of feeling claustrophobic, even though being out in a wide open space.
Yeah, because this is bleak scrubland. So again, we're not in the dark forest. We're not in caves or anything else. And yet, like you say, it does seem like everything is focused in on this point, on this strange event that's going on. The apparent causeless movement of the herbage, good use of the word herbage there, I like that.
Yeah.
And the slow, undeviating approach of the line of disturbance were distinctly disquieting. Nice alliterations, disturbance, distinctly disquieting. And this causes Morgan to throw up his shotgun and let blast.
The Agitated Grain, which I thought that would be a great name for a pub, I think. The Agitated Grain.
That is. That makes a change from band names, doesn't it?
It does, doesn't it? Yeah. Yeah. Well, before the smoke of the discharge had cleared away, he heard a loud, savage cry, a scream like that of a wild animal. And basically Morgan flings his gun on the ground and legs it, pretty much.
Yeah, he fails his sand roll here, doesn't he? Even though
he does,
he's fired the gun and he's off.
Mm-hmm.
And Harker gets sort of knocked over by something. He can't see anything there, but something barges into him and knocks him over. And I thought the description was good. Some soft, heavy substance that seemed thrown against me with great force. I think it's the word soft there is what makes it creepy.
Yes, it brings to mind, you know, it's all them kind of words that describe something, because you expect things to have a certain rigidity, even the human body, when it brushes against you. You expect a bony elbow or something like that. Yeah. But when you get something a bit pulpy,
yes,
you know, it's, you know, pulpy and soft, it's kind of maggoty, grave worms, and it just brings to mind lots of squirming, horrible things that live in the dirt, doesn't it?
Absolutely, very much that feeling, yeah. And before he can get up and recover his gun, which he obviously dropped when he fell, he hears Morgan crying out as if in mortal agony, and mingling with his cries were such hoarse, savage sounds as one hears from fighting dogs. Mm-hmm. So this is an interesting creature because it's it's not just one voice from the sound of it. It says savage sounds like fighting dogs. Yeah. And obviously, if you hear a pack of dogs barking or even a couple of dogs, that's very distinct from a single lone animal.
Yeah, definitely. Because, I mean, further, like earlier on, it says a noise was similar to a bear, didn't it?
Yeah.
So you've got bears, dogs, that kind of guttural, roaring... thing.
That's all quite mammalian, isn't it? If you know what I mean, growls and howls and that sort of. So on the one hand, we have this sort of soft, pulpy feel to it, but the sound it's producing is quite, almost familiar.
Yes. Yeah.
And this is where we see, you can see it 30 yards away. Morgan is down on one knee. his head thrown back at a frightful angle, hatless. you know it's serious in a Victorian story when a chap is hatless.
Oh yeah. Well, interestingly, just cutting back to the first chapter, there's a bit when they're having the inquest, in the annotation in this version I've got, it says, "Gentlemen customarily remove their hats when inside a building, even a log cabin. This is yet another mark of distinction setting the coroner apart from the others," because he still had his hat on. Hats are incredibly important to the Victorians.
Very important. And yeah, poor old Morgan is having a bad time of it. It actually reminded me, this section, of our young dog Buster, who some of you may have heard in recent episodes.
The hellhound.
The hellhound.
Yeah.
When he picks up one of his toys and just rags it about. This is what I get is happening to Morgan here. His right arm was lifted and seemed to lack the hand. It's like parts of him are being blotted out, and it seems as though this invisible thing is either picking him up, or it's got part of it in its mouth or something like that, and he's sort of shaking him about in violent movement from side to side, backward and forward. He's not having a good time of it, is he?
No. It is that thing that dogs do, isn't it? When they grab something, they, shake their head side to side, rip and tear. I think it's interesting to point out here that though the creature is invisible, it blots out. So it's not a classic invisibility. It's more like a refraction of light.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually, because you tend to think invisible, you see through it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but this is almost like, well, I guess that ties in with the explanation at the end, doesn't it?
Indeed it does.
Yeah.
And it also, which is something you mentioned before we came on, that this bit just reminds me of the scene in The Predator.
Absolutely. Well, it was one of my things. Shall we mention this here as that's come up? Because invisible monsters. I don't know if this was the first, but it was certainly one of the early ones. I think we had the Hauler, 1887, Guy de Maupassant, which was I think that was an invisible creature of a slightly different type. And you have to wonder if this was any influence on Wells. Actually, The Invisible Man was 1897.
Yeah, well, that Maupassant and O'Brien, who wrote a story of Invisible Thing as well. These are the three stories that are supposed to have influenced Wells.
Ah, right. That's interesting. Yeah. And I mean, as we say, the Invisible Man, he is translucent, right? That's the shirt making a phone call thing again, isn't it?
Yes, indeed, yeah.
Things floating through the air and all that kind of stuff, which this creature isn't. Because as we find out at the end, spoiler alert, it's not that it's invisible, it's that it is of a colour that we cannot perceive.
Yes. Yeah.
And this is where it ties us directly into our Lovecraft, right? Because we've got to think of the colour out of space.
Yeah.
Is an obvious parallel.
Yeah, definitely. There's also parallels with a couple of other of his stories as well, isn't there? The Unnameable.
Yes.
And another one that I had it in my head earlier, and I should have wrote it down, but it's completely gone. It'll probably come back to me before the end.
Well, what it put me in mind of was Whately Senior in the Dunwich Horror. This huge invisible monster trampling. I mean, that was literally walking through houses, wasn't it, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it was only invisible when it was it the powder of Ibn Ghazi or something they sprayed
That's the
on
one.
it? Yeah.
Yep.
And again, you get that notion of it's not actually invisible, it's just not of this dimension. So
we just can't perceive it.
We just can't perceive it. Which, I mean, that ties in with From Beyond as well, I suppose, doesn't it, really?
Yeah, quite a lot of things. And like Belknap Long, the Space Eaters, I see that there's a direct line from this to the Space Eaters.
Yeah.
In terms of, because I mean, it even sort of lurks around trees and just hunts people,
So again, we in the best tradition of any weird tale, we don't get any explanation of the creature, its origins, or where it's from. Is it of this earth or of this dimension? But again, it's that nice notion that we talk about a lot with Lovecraft of interdimensional creatures. We can only perceive certain aspects of them in our dimension.
Yeah.
And with Whately Senior, one of the aspects that we couldn't perceive was its shape, its colour. Which,
Yeah,
so, yeah, it's nice to see these connections going on between all these different authors.
definitely. Yeah, and basically, like I said at the top about it being influential, it's credited as influencing the Predator and the Thing and things like that. So,
I have to say this time when I read it, because I'd not read it for years, this story. I mean, it's one of the classics. I remember reading it. But about halfway in, perhaps because I watched the new Predator film a couple of months back, I just suddenly thought that this is a Predator. I mean, it could literally be the Predator.
Yeah. Well, what it reminds me of is that scene in the first film with Mac, when he gets his arm ripped off and the Predator basically sticks his blades in him and lifts him up. So you see him lift off the ground and you've just got the weird refraction of light off him. Sort of thing. That's what it reminded me of, this death scene here. That's what it reminded me of.
And it is a death scene because poor old Morgan, even though, give him his due, he goes out fighting this guy, Morgan assumed all the postures of a determined wrestler vanquished by superior weight and strength. So, he's trying to fight back. But, of course, this thing is way too powerful for him.
I've just got images of him trying to get a formless horror in a figure four leg lock.
I remember Big Daddy. I remember Kendo Nagasaki.
Kendo.
I don't remember Formless Horror on the Saturday afternoon wrestling.
World of Sport with Dickie Davis.
Harker runs over to... He throws down his gun and runs over to assist him. I'm not sure... Well, I suppose he doesn't want to hit his friend. He doesn't want to fire, not if they've got a buckshot in.
Yeah, and he probably wouldn't do any good anyway, would it? If it wouldn't kill a deer, it's not going to kill whatever was mauling his friend.
Well, yeah. And then we get this, which I wonder, bearing in mind we spoke earlier about Bierce's brain injury and his fits, I had a vague belief that he was suffering from a fit or some form of convulsion. So is that a little bit of personal experience coming in there as well?
Yeah, very possibly, because you actually get quite a bit in Bierce's stories. He always puts in things that happen to him. He puts in personal experiences. And it's interesting earlier because you're talking about back at the coroner thing. Some of the jurors laughed about a joke. I think it was about the I don't read your stories bit, right? And it's about gallows humour.
Yeah.
And against a somber background, humour shows highlights. Soldiers in the intervals of battle laugh easily. And basically in the annotations, it says that in one of his stories from the war, Bierce describes a group of men who are busy reciting a hilarious joke about a man being torn in half by a cannonball when they are startled by something crashing into their camp. What is so funny about a man being shot in two is probably something that only soldiers can attempt to explain. So,
yeah, and it's that real life coping mechanism, isn't it, that we spoke. But also that other thing that we speak about a lot, this sort of connection of horror and humour, where if we go back in time, the grim tales and everything else.
Oh, yeah.
Grim, but also why is it funny when someone gets their leg bitten off by an ogre or something?
Yeah, exactly. It's like Billy Connolly tells a joke about when he was working at the shipyards and a friend of his got his finger cut off, and a mate was telling him down the pub, and he was roaring with laughter, and he's like, and his finger just popped right off there. It's weird, isn't it?
So by the time he gets there, Morgan is dead, and that brings us into chapter 3, and we're back in the cabin now. Harker has recounted his experiences, and now it's the coroner's turn, or the coroner's going to pass his verdict.
Lifting the edge of a sheet, he pulled it away, exposing the entire body. Altogether naked and showing in the candlelight a clay-like yellow. Nice.
I thought this was quite detailed for the time. I mean, I suppose there's a discussion there. It might be interesting to have some time about how accurately or in how much detail these things are depicted. I mean, obviously, when we look back at old films from the 30s and 40s, I don't think you even see any blood, do you, in those old films?
No, but Bierce was quite unusual, I think, because a lot of his stuff is pretty damn explicitly gory. I mean, there's a story that I read as it's in the Some Haunted Houses when I did the reading of it it's up on the website. One of the stories there, I can't remember which one it is, the Spook House maybe. But anyway, there's a house that's supposed to be haunted. This reporter goes to spend a night in it, and there's apparitions, and they're kicking a severed head around the floor.
Wow.
Like a football. He's just like, well, you don't get that in Conan Doyle.
No, for that time, it does seem quite, like you say, quite explicit and quite unusual. And I wonder here, because of the language used, if this was Bierce drawing on from his journalistic background. Maybe he'd attended autopsies, perhaps, if he was reporting on cases. Because this is what he says. It had, however, broad maculations of bluish black, obviously caused by extravasated blood from contusions. The chest and sides looked as if they had been beaten with a bludgeon. There were dreadful lacerations. The skin was torn in strips and shreds. So it's very detailed, but in a quite precise, clinical way it's described.
Yeah, that's Bierce's style all over. That journalistic, yeah.
And then we get the real punchline, if you pardon the expression, when there's a silk handkerchief that is tied around the throat of the deceased, and the coroner removes it. And I did like this. This is such a human reaction, right? You can imagine what a mess the throat is, and all he says is it exposed what had been the throat. And some of the jurors who had risen to get a better view, because everyone does, right, repented their curiosity. And, you know, there's even Harker opened the window and had a quick heave.
It leaned out, yeah. Well, it's rubbernecking, isn't it? Or it's when you get a road accident and people slow down and wind the window down and stick their head out the window. You know, it's the same thing.
Yeah. It's that ghoulish curiosity. Well, actually, we shouldn't mention the G word too much, seeing as they're in town. They can burrow in. You think mice are bad? They can get in anywhere as well, through your skirting board even.
Yeah, it takes more than a bit of plywood to fix that hole as well, doesn't it? You need something a lot worse than cheese to put in your trap as well, I'm telling you.
Oh dear. Yeah, you need something not too fresh, wouldn't you? Really?
Exactly.
Nice and fragrant.
Gamey.
So this is it's just a couple of paragraphs, this chapter, and we have this beautiful line as well, because having seen the state of the body, everyone draws their own conclusions. Well, they all draw the same conclusion. And the conclusion is that what Harker told them is absolute nonsense.
Cobblers.
Yeah, and this is obviously, he was killed by a mountain lion. And one of the foreman is described as a tall bearded man of 60, coarsely clad. I should like to ask one question, Mr. Coroner, he said. What asylum did this witness escape from? So poor Harker's testimony is just put down to him being not of sound mind.
Yeah, I like the fact that the coroner doesn't rebuke the foreman. He just turns around and says, Mr. Harker, said the coroner, gravely and tranquilly, from what asylum did you last escape?
Yes, and Harker's not happy at it. We get the 7 jurors rose solemnly and filed out of the cabinet. If you have done insulted me, sir, said Harker, I suppose I am at liberty to go. And this is where we get this mention of the book again, which tells us what really happened. Yeah,
like this, Harker turns to him and says, the book that you have there, I recognise it as Morgan's diary. You seemed gravely interested in it. You read in it while I was testifying. May I see it? The public might like to. And yeah, the official basically says, no, the book will cut no figure in this matter. All the entries in it were made before the writer's death. Of course they were.
Well, that is, that's quite, it'd be quite spectacular if they were made after his death, wouldn't it? That would be something. But I thought about this as well. This is a conspiracy theory, isn't it now?
Yeah.
Here's the evidence of strange goings on. of some anomalous event that there's no real explanation for. Well, we've got this explanation, we've got this evidence, but we're going to ignore that. No one's going to see that. You get the impression he'll just chuck the diary on the fire or something before he goes, you know.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's it. The foreman seats himself near the candle, produces a pencil and a scrap of paper, and wrote rather laboriously the following verdict, which, with various degrees of effort, all signed. So, not an educated crowd of people. We, the jury, do find that the remains come to their death at the hands of a mountain lion, but some of us thinks all the same they had fits. So he died of a kind of mixture of having a fit and being attacked by a mountain lion. A combination of the two.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the annotation, it says an intentionally comical, Twain-esque parody of rural Americans' self-important, easygoing ways, even when consulting in a vicious death. So yeah, that's a great example of Bierce's biting satire.
Yes, yeah. And I suppose in a way we can say that's a human thing. People just want to find the easiest explanation.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
You know? I mean, I know there's that Occam's razor thing, which is, you know, the most likely explanation is probably the real one, which is okay in a general sense, but when you've got that other evidence in terms of the diary in this case, that's just totally ignored. So,
yeah,
you know, it's easier just to say, yeah, mountain lion, and that's it, end of the matter.
Yeah.
So that brings us into chapter 4, and this is where we get the contents of Morgan's diary.
Yeah, so it turns out this wasn't the first time we'd encountered it, as, you know, was hinted by him calling it the damned thing. Yeah, because this is over a period of about a month, isn't it? These entries. They're only short entries, but...
Yeah, we go September through into October. Mm-hmm. The date of the first entries cannot be ascertained because the upper part of the leaf is torn away. But he seems to be talking about his dog that would run in a half circle, keeping his head turned always towards the centre, and would stand still barking furiously and then run off. And we get this question, can a dog see with his nose? Do odours impress some olfactory centre with images of the thing emitting them? Well, we certainly know that dogs and other animals have a far greater sense of smell than we do.
Yeah.
Which, again, I guess feeds into that idea that comes through in this of our limited range of senses, which, again, is very Lovecraftian.
Yeah, you also have the thing that where it's believed that dogs and cats can see things we can't as well. That's why, like, people say that dogs can see ghosts and cats. Because I mean, I've always had cats, and you'll be sitting there and you won't be doing anything. The cat will suddenly just freak out for no apparent reason.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It's like, is the cat mad or has it seen something? You know.
Well, the first time we took our dog down to the in-laws in Plymouth, they got a very old Victorian house, and there's some things there possibly. Well, long story short, the dog would sit in the hall and he'd be looking up the stairs as though he was looking at someone. Very distinct pose, you know.
Yeah.
And take it for what it's worth, but later it was discovered in the old fireplace that they cleared out in the front room. There was a little plaque that was a memorial to the son of the house at the time who was killed in World War One, and various other odd little things that went on.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, quite, you know, almost like your typical ghost story in some ways.
Yeah, that's very Jamesian, isn't it?
Yeah, and I offer that up without any sort of proof or anything at all, you know, but it's just a personal experience. So, yes, obviously dogs can scent things that we can't see, they can hear things that we can't hear, but he does see something as well, doesn't he, Mr. Morgan?
Yeah, because he's September the 2nd. Looking at the stars last night as they rose above the crest of the ridge east of the house, I observed them successively disappear from left to right. Each was eclipsed but an instant, and only a few at the same time, but along the entire length of the ridge. All that were within a degree or two of the crest were blotted out. It was as if something had passed along between me and them, but I could not see it, and the stars were not thick enough to define its outline. So there you go.
And that ties back in earlier with what you said about this thing isn't translucent. It has a sort of certain mass to it, or a density, because it is blotting out light. Then it's a few weeks. Then we're through to September the 27th. And it has been about here again. I find evidences of its presence every day. So he's walking around with his gun in hand now, because obviously this has got him on edge. And he finds footprints this time. He's having trouble sleeping. Is he going mad? Perhaps I'm mad already.
Well, this reminds me of Whisper in the Darkness. You got Akeley and he finds the weird footprints and scuffling noises on the roof and all that.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I never thought of that. Yeah. And it's a similar thing because this might only be a little log cabin out in the middle of nowhere, but it's his log cabin. This is my house, my land.
Exactly.
God hates a coward.
I like that line. It's very, very telling of the chap, isn't it?
Yes. Stiff upper lip. Well, we're in America, not Britain, but it's still sort of stiff upper lip territory, isn't it?
Oh yeah, very much so. I mean, if this was in the UK, he'd be wearing tweed and have a stiff upper lip and probably a luxurious moustache.
He'd have servants out hunting for it. That would be the difference.
Yeah, it would. Yeah.
And we learned that this is why he invited Harker to come hunting. Well, not really to come hunting with him, but just to spend a few weeks with him, because Harker has got a level head, and I suppose he's going to rely on Harker to. Will Harker see this as well, or
or do I need to?
Is this all in his mind? Yeah.
Is it real, or do I need to take an extended holiday at the funny farm, sort of thing?
And this is where we get the last sort of couple of paragraphs of the story, which is the explanation, or as much of an explanation as we get. Because as we mentioned, we know there are sounds that we can't hear, and he likens this to when you see a flock of birds all suddenly take off at once because of some sound or something that they've seen that we don't even know about. And the other example that I like was the whales. It is known to seamen that a school of whales basking or sporting on the surface of the ocean, miles apart, with the convexity of the earth between them, will sometimes dive at the same instant, all gone out of sight in a moment. And I don't know when this became scientific knowledge that whales can communicate over vast distances.
No.
I'm not sure when that would have been known as a scientific fact, but certainly that's what he's talking about here. So I guess that maybe is something that had been observed a long time ago.
It reminded me of recently. I was just sitting in a graveyard having a gin in a tin with Linda. We got to Pevensey Castle and we decided to go and have a sit down and have a gin in a tin. It was getting sort of dusk, and there was on top of the spire there was a weather vane, and it was covered in starlings. Like I counted them. There was about 50 of the little buggers, and they were there for the whole time we were sitting there. And then all of a sudden, without a warning, they all just went, poof, just not a single one left. It was just like, what do they know that we don't?
It is amazing, that sort of, what would you call it, like a herd or a hive or a flock mentality, isn't it?
Yeah.
And again, when you see, is it a murmuration? Is that the word for for when you get the big flock of birds?
Yes.
Moving in those incredible patterns. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And I suppose if you're sat in a graveyard at a certain time of day, that can be quite unnerving.
Well, yeah. Just realised that if people didn't know I was a goth, they certainly do now.
Or a wino.
Yeah.
Or a wino
goth wino, yeah. There you go.
I might be drunk, but I'm drunk in style.
Exactly.
So having spoken about that, he now applies the same logic to colours. At each end of the solar spectrum, the chemist can detect the presence of what are known as actinic rays. What does actinic mean? Do you know what they are?
Yeah, actinic is relating to or denoting light able to cause photochemical reactions, as in photography, though having a significant short wavelength or ultraviolet component.
Ah, okay.
So I guess it's similar to what the Kirlian. Is that how you pronounce it? Kirlian photography?
Oh, right, where they take a photo of the aura kind of thing.
Auras and things like that, yeah.
Yes, they represent colours, integral colours in the composition of light, which we are unable to discern. The human eye is an imperfect instrument. Its range is but a few octaves of the real chromatic scale. That's nice, sort of putting the chromatic scale into the idea of music and octaves. I am not mad. There are colours that we cannot see.
Yeah.
And then the closing line, and God help me, the damned thing is of such a colour.
Love it.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that this guy who, well, from the description we get of the jurors, quite rough, not very well educated country types. Yet Morgan has worked all this out just through observation.
Yeah.
He's not a scientist, is he? Well, maybe he is a scientist. Perhaps he's given up on science and become a hermit for some reason. I don't know.
Yeah, well, the thing is, I mean, his mate is an author and chap about town, so maybe he is, you know.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
He's not just some yokel farmer, is he? By the sounds of it, if he's got cultured friends, it would imply at that time that, you know, in that sort of society, you know, when there was generally a class structure, you know, that's kind of what I'm taking from it anyway.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, and he's made this choice to go and live this solitary lifestyle. Which again, you know, living in a cabin out in California scrubland put me very much in mind of Clark Ashton Smith.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so, yeah.
So they both lived in roughly the same area, Smith and Bierce. Was there any connection between them? Were they correspondents?
Yes, they were both correspondents of Samuel Loveman, who was a close friend of both, and that's how they met. Obviously, Smith was a lot younger, but he was part of that San Francisco poetry scene, which was people like Ambrose Bierce and Samuel Loveman and De Castries and all these other guys. Basically, all the people who are mentioned in Fritz Leiber's Our Lady of Darkness.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah, it's that circle of which Smith was a sort of a junior member. So, yeah, he did correspond with Bierce. And not as much as Loveman did, but, yeah, he did definitely... I recall in a letter to Loveman, Smith was talking about some kind words Bierce had said about his first book of poetry. So, yeah. Oh, Sterling, that's another one. Who was
George Sterling.
George Sterling, yeah.
It was sort of Smith's mentor, was he? As
yes,
far as,
and he was
the poetry went.
Yeah, and he was close friends with Ambrose Bierce. So, yeah.
And there is that interesting thing that we've mentioned before, whereas people think that Smith joined the Lovecraft circle, but in fact, it's almost more the case that Lovecraft joined the Smith circle, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, definitely. Yeah, because there was these people who, all Smith already had a circle, didn't he?
Yeah, he had his own circle.
Yeah, the San Francisco Poetry Circle or something. You know, it's.
And as we mentioned earlier, Bierce moved to San Francisco in 1879. That's where he really focused on his journalism career. But I never knew this. Prior to that, he was living in England. 1872 to 75, he was living in England, and that's where he had his first book published, Fiend's Delight.
Oh, I didn't know that either.
That was, that was published in London in 1873 under the name Dodd Grill.
No, there's a pseudonym.
Odd sort. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what that comes from. I might have a closer look at that, see if we can find anything. D-O-D, then G-R-I-L-E. Dodd Grill, Dodd Grile. Strange, isn't it?
Fair enough.
It's not like John Smith, is it? Or something like that, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose it's like Dickens, wasn't he? Went under the pen name Boz, which was equally unusual. Although apparently that referred to Moses, because that was one of his middle names was Moses, but he always used to pronounce it Boses, and Boses became Boz. So.
Oh, right, okay. Nice.
That's why Dickens went out as Boz. Yeah.
Nice.
Though after that, when he dropped it, he went by the pen name The Inimitable. And Boz was actually originally pronounced Bose, so that fits in with the Boses thing.
Boz sounds like somebody you'd bump into in a Shoreditch boozer, doesn't it?
No, you don't want to bump into Boz.
No, exactly.
Did you spill my pint?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking of. Millwall support, I gotta be. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And of course, the other fact that everyone knows about Bierce is that he disappeared, vanished without trace, and led to some rather strange rumours and, well, conspiracy theories, really, and sightings, didn't it? I know we spoke about a little about this on the Strange Shadows podcast, but there were some really strange ones, weren't there?
Yeah, my favourites being that he went on a search for the Skull of Doom, which sounds like something out of Indiana Jones, and that he perished trying to get the skull back into the United States across the Mexico border. And my other favourite is that he was later spotted wearing jaguar skins in charge of a tribe of like Aztec people,
isn't it?
Out in the wilderness.
Isn't that brilliant? Yeah, was he like their high priest or something like that? Or
like a shaman or something. Yeah.
I think, as we said when we discussed that before, you like to think that is the case, isn't it?
Yeah.
Rather than probably the more mundane or far less pleasant ending. The last letter that he wrote was dated December the 26th, 1913. Basically, in 1913, he'd gone on a tour of American Civil War battlefields, which, of course, many of which he'd been present at. And he went south of the border down into Mexico. He joined Pancho Villa's army as an observer. And, as I say, the last letter was December the 26th, 1913, to a lady friend. And it said, or it finished with, "I leave here tomorrow for an unknown destination." That's the last line, isn't it, for a writer to leave?
Yeah. It's like the classic Captain Oates, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, I'm going out. I may be gone some time. It's the same sort of thing.
Spine tingling, isn't it? That sort of thing. And there is speculation, because he had said the way he wanted to die was, going in action kind of thing, or being shot by a firing squad, rather than giving in to the vicissitudes of old age and dotage and that kind of stuff. He sort of wanted to go out on his feet, And there was this story in one place. Well, he was seen in Chihuahua in January 1914, and then another town called Sierra Majada. There's a long-standing story in that place that Bierce was shot by a firing squad, which the local priest seemed to support. He said he witnessed it. So I don't know. So many years later, I don't know how we'll ever find out the truth.
I don't think we ever will. It's like interesting. The reason we've talked about it before, it was during one of our patron specials for Strange Shadows, where we go through the letters, and it was letters between Loveman and Smith, and they were talking about, and this was like into like the 20s and 30s, and they were still saying like, "Oh, I heard the other day a friend of mine said he saw Bierce in London," and things like that. Right. It was like even that, like decades later, he was cropping up. It was almost like Elvis now,
And in some ways, it was almost as big news from the sound of it. This was huge at the time.
Yeah, definitely.
So just one last little interesting or amusing fact about Bierce. He was one of 13 children, and his father's name was Aurelius Marcus, I think, and each of the 13 children's names began with A. So he had like a sister Amy, and there was an Albert. 13 kids, all their names beginning with A. I thought it was quite an interesting little fact.
You can imagine if they did a roll call at like the local fire station or something. Bierce A, Bierce A, Bierce A.
Perhaps they were Scousers. Hey, Bierce, hey,
Bierce, hey.
Apologies to any of our listeners from Liverpool.
Hello, Callum.
Hello, Callum.
Oh, we're all right. He always sends me that gif of the Scousers and calm down.
So, yeah, as we mentioned, loads of adaptations of Bierce. The one I just wanted to mention quickly was, because I've got this magazine still, it was Creepy magazine, Creepy number 4. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but there was Creepy and Eerie, and they were sort of versions of the old Tales from the Crypt magazine. I guess they probably 70s. I think they might have come out.
Yeah, 70s, early 80s, I think.
Yeah. And Creepy number 4 has The Damned Thing in it, and it's a pretty good adaptation, actually. The art is by Gray Morrow, and the cover of Creepy number 4 is by Frazetta. It's a great Frazetta picture of a werewolf attacking this lone man on a road with a huge red moon behind him, really.
I think I know exactly which one you're talking about. It's one of his famous ones.
Yeah, one of his great horror ones, because I think he did a Dracula versus werewolf. I don't know if he did all those for Creepy. Would they be at Warren Publishing, possibly, I'm guessing? But anyway, that might be available online. If I can find it online, we'll put a link up to it in the show notes.
Excellent. Yeah, and The Damned Thing has been adapted multiple times for TV and film. There's more student films of The Damned Thing that you can shake a stick at, like short student productions. But in 1975, there was a TV movie made by Yugoslav broadcaster Radio Television Belgrade. It was entitled Prokletinja, which is a Serbo-Croatian pronunciation of The Damned Thing. And it's actually on YouTube. I found it this morning. So we'll put the link down in there. And I actually watched it this morning, and it is really, it's the most faithful adaptation you could possibly think. It's pretty much scene for scene. It's really well, it's actually really well done. It's creepy. There's no English subtitles. So, but if you don't know the language, you don't really need to, because it's, the dialogue follows the minimal dialogue in the story.
Yeah.
And you can just infer what's going on. You don't really need to know the language to enjoy it. I thought it was it's black and white. It's a really good production. And then in 2006, Toby Hooper did a version of it for Masters of Horror. But I'd like to stress that it was inspired by, as opposed to based on.
It was quite a change, wasn't it? I think.
Yeah, it was totally different. Yeah. It was completely different.
Yeah, Richard Matheson wrote that as well. He was involved in the screenwriting of that. So normally, if it's Richard Matheson involved, it's going to be a good, good program.
It's really good. It is really good, but it's got very little to do with it. It's more of a sequel, and because it starts in 1981 before going to the present day of the time, and it's about it starts off with a family that are obsessed with ribs for some reason, sitting around the dinner table. They're having this big conversation about sticky barbecue ribs, and it's just like, fair enough, whatever floats your boat. And a storm hits, and it's the dad's birthday, and they go to muck about with the birthday cake. And there's some goo appears, and the dad gets possessed, shoots the mum, chases the kid. The kid escapes, and then it cuts to him in the future.
Right.
He's now the sheriff of this small town. And basically, to cut a long story short, the same sort of thing starts happening. The wind gets up, the damned thing appears, starts mucking with people's minds. People commit suicide, all this. There's a lot, because it's Toby Hooper, there's a lot of gore. There's a very gory scene of a man bashing his own brains in with a hammer.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. Oh, and the one that actually made me go ew, like a little girl was a bit. There's a car accident, and the sheriff hears it, and he gets in his Jeep and goes down the road to help.
Yeah. And
there's this woman lying on the road, which is sort of her body's under the car. And he's like, I'll help you. He's got no signal. So he's like, I'll help you. I'll get you in my thing and take you to hospital. And he goes down, picks her up by the armpits, and her body comes away. So they are.
Nice.
It's the noise. Yeah. So, and then he's estranged from his wife and child, and he goes to their trailer, and the wind's hammering, and his wife gets possessed by the damn thing, and all this. But it comes out that his father was originally from a place called Sturgis, which is where the damned thing is some people think took place.
Oh, right, that's the setting. Was an actual
place.
And
it was supposed to. It had been disturbed by people drilling for oil. That was the explanation in this. So it's kind of like a long sequel, basically.
Yeah. I mean, that has kind of elements of sort of Wendigo type stuff
Indeed,
in it as well,
it
doesn't
does.
From the sounds of it.
Yeah, it is almost like a mashup of Bierce and Blackwood. I think it's really good. It's a really good cosmic horror. I mean, don't just as long as you don't expect it to be Bierce's The Damned Thing. If you think of it as like I say, like a sequel, then I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really good.
Which, to be honest, is often the case for most of these adaptations.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah.
But to be fair, again, if you look at this purely as it is on the page, I think a lot of modern writers, especially for TV, they want to add more things in.
Yes.
You don't see much that is minimalist. I think most modern adaptations would struggle with The Willows, for example.
Yeah, which is interesting because somebody is apparently making it. A Canadian director is apparently making it.
Did your sort of heart sink a little bit?
It did. It did. It was just like...
So we're going to have a party of teenagers on a cruise.
This is exactly what I thought. I had horrible nightmares of that. I had horrible nightmares of that. Do you remember that god-awful remake of The Fog?
Oh, well, yeah.
Where they ended up with a group of teenagers having a rave in the middle in the sea, and you had this John Woo effects, bullet time zombie with a hook coming out of the sea, and I turned it off. It's just like, that's crap. So
it's just that thing when they go for obvious beats and tropes and the jump scare above the atmosphere. Yeah. I mean, to some extent, the remake of The Woman in Black, the film, was like that, wasn't it?
It was, but I think it was a lot better than some. But it was still not a patch on the old Nigel Neal version.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. And, as we say with cosmic horror, the challenge is in getting that horror across, that existential horror, that internal feeling.
Yeah.
But then, if someone can create that on the page, then surely someone equally as committed or skillful should be able to put that across on the screen, I think.
Yeah, you'd think, wouldn't you?
Yeah. Or you can get some teenagers in and have blood spraying across them, and
yeah, across the some bare flesh,
chesty substances, busty substances.
Yeah. So it's well worth watching just for cosmic horror aficionados. There is actually another film adaptation. It's part of an anthology film. Oh, it's called New Creepy Tales, the anthology. It came out in 2019. I can't find it. It's one of those films that is on IMDb, but I can't find it.
It doesn't ring any bells.
But last adaptation that I'd like to mention is an audio adaptation that was done recently as part of a new podcast. And these are hybrid audiobooks and dramatizations.
Right.
So they're basically audio dramas. And it's actually a friend of mine, Jonathan Inbuddy, who's done these. It's called Grey Matter is the podcast, and they did a superb adaptation of The Damned Thing. I think it was their second episode. I think they're up to 5 episodes now, and it's all weird tales. So yeah, they recently did one of Wells's more obscure and bizarre stories. It's a great series. So I'd like to probably get Jonathan on at some point, because I recently interviewed him for my radio show.
Oh yeah, and
we were talking about obviously, as what usually happens with people like that, we ended up going down a rabbit hole and talking about dodgy adaptations of Lovecraft and all that kind of stuff. So yeah,
excellent. Yeah, well, we'll definitely get a link up to that in the show notes. But I look forward to listening to that. I think that's where the Weird Tale can work extremely well, is in the audio presentations.
Definitely, it's like the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society, their Dark Adventure Radio Theatre. I adore those things. Yeah. It was like last year I got incredibly excited when they said there was a new one coming out. I was like, yeah! And Linda was like, what are you so happy about? And I was like, well, a new episode of Dark Adventure Radio Theatre. And she looked at me like I'd just beamed down from Saturn.
Like, you're so sad. Oh,
yeah. It was just like, fine there. Okay, whatever floats your boat,
And I think I saw just the other day, they're releasing Robert E. Howard's The Black Stone as well.
They are, yes. I'm very excited about that.
Really looking forward to. Yeah, I equal your excitement with that. Because that's. We did cover that a little while back, didn't we? It's an excellent story. One of Howard's best horror stories and mythos stories as well.
Yeah, it's one of the, in my humble opinion, and the humble opinion of Mr. Ramsey Campbell,
Oh, wow.
it's one of the best mythos stories that isn't by Lovecraft.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll totally go along with that. Yeah, yeah. So there we are, folks. That's our first Ambrose Bierce, even though he casts a long shadow.
Yes,
and
indeed.
he's been mentioned, probably mentioned in more times than any other author apart from Lovecraft, to be honest.
Yeah, especially in Strange Shadows, because he was a big influence on Clark Ashton Smith, so it's kind of hard to avoid him, really.
Yes, yes. So do let us know what you think of the story. If you think there's anything we've missed there or any points you'd like to raise. And also your favourite adaptations, not just of Bierce, but one nice thing with this is we're both discovering new adaptations all the time and sequels and that kind of thing. So if there's anything out there that you think we might not have seen, then do let us know. We're always keen to look at new, well, if they're films or stories, whatever they are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I got rather excited this morning because I went on IMDb and did Ambrose Bierce, and they all came up, and I was like, hang on a minute, what's that? TV movie based on it was like, okay, so I did a quick Google and I found it, and I was, yeah, so that was I ate my breakfast and watched the damned thing in Croatian.
That's a good start to the day.
Yeah.
Were you eating those Innsmouth mushrooms again?
Yes.
Or was it the sea nuggets?
Sea nuggets, nice.
Breakfast in Innsmouth. That should be the name of. Wasn't that a Supertramp album? Breakfast in Innsmouth.
Breakfast. Yeah.
If not, it should.
It should have been. It really should have been.
Well, dusk is falling, and we've got reports of those ghouls hanging about, and I see. Well, it looks like the procession has gone. They're up in the church. I can hear a distant tolling of the bell.
Yeah.
So I think it's a good time for us to leave Innsmouth at Christmas. Oh, here's the bus now. Here's our wonderful bus driver. So before we go, there's just a couple of things we wanted to mention. We were speaking about audio adaptations earlier, and obviously you can get a lot of good audio adaptations on Audible. And it turns out, it transpired, I discovered this week, thanks to my wife, you can also get the Innsmouth Book Club and Strange Shadows on Audible as well.
That's amazing. That's brilliant. I've actually got quite a bit of a presence on Audible now, because I've got my novella Spiffing. There's an audio book with the Nookie-Nomicon. There's an audio book of that.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there you go. You can get us on Audible, and I think we're on a lot of the other services as well. As we say, Tim and I are both absolutely useless when it comes to all this newfangled technology. We know how to work cassette recorders and 8-track mixers.
I'm a dab hand at fixing a VHS player or something like that. But you get me near anything digital, and I'm knackered.
But we do appreciate a lot of these providers do have the capacity for you to leave a review, so any reviews you could leave for us would be very welcome to help us spread the word. And speaking of which, as we come to the end of another year, our sort of second year really, we want to say a big thank you, because this is the last episode of the year, of course. We want to say a big thank you to everyone who's appeared on the show, all the guests we've had on over the last 12 months. And of course, we want to give a huge special festival shout out to our patrons. So a big thanks to Rob Weaver, David A. Riley, A.T. Johnston, Gary Pennington, Benjamin Slade, Brett Kramer, Aaron Vleck, Steve Meyer, Wingate Stites, Russell Journey, Justin Woodman, Lee Clark Zumper, Sharon Safia, Lane Mullin, Rick Seam, Nick Lorimer, and, of course, last and by no means least, the ever wonderful and fabulous Chris Carr. Thank you all very much indeed for your support.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and if you'd like to join our ever-growing list of Patreons and help us spread our tentacles around the globe, just click the link on our Patreon page and that'll take you right there. And now it doesn't just get you the Innsmouth Book Club, it also gets you Strange Shadows, and you also get a copy of the Innsmouth News every month. So it's well worth checking out.
Yes, and we're going to be tweaking our patron tiers over the holidays. We're going to be looking at new things. Do let us know as well if there's anything you want. Obviously, we've got bonus episodes going out, We're looking at maybe doing some merchandise. And I should mention as well, as this goes out on the Saturday, tomorrow on the Sunday, we've got a live chat special where if you're a patron, you can come and join us in Innsmouth. Of course, if you're a regular listener, then you can send in your questions. You can send them in to dagonsack@outlook.com, or you can leave them on our Facebook page or leave a comment on our YouTube page, and we'll do our best to answer your questions. But our patrons will be sent out a link where you'll be able to sign in and join us live. And really, we're just open to any questions at all, aren't we? We don't know what to expect.
Yeah, we're just going to have a bit of a chat, really, and wing it. Just go for it. Why not? Yeah.
So that's happening tomorrow. Patrons can join us live, and then we'll put that out as an episode, probably sometime over Christmas. And we've got some readings as well that will be going out over the festival season.
Indeed, yeah. I've done a reading of one of my stories, The Abomination That Came for Christmas, and the festival. And I believe you did a reading of Clark Ashton Smith.
Yes, it was The Crypts of Memory, which was a prose poem, and that formed the basis for The Planet of the Dead, which we covered recently on Strange Shadows.
Perfect.
So that was quite a challenge, reading Smith.
I was just about to say, I bet you had the same problem doing that as I did with Lovecraft and the festival. They didn't believe in short sentences, did they?
Oh man, you learn about breath control when you've got
Don't
to
you
do
just?
a sentence that is a whole paragraph, you know.
There was one bit in that when he starts mentioning all these old tomes, and I just couldn't do it.
Obviously, Old Tomes is a great name for a butler, isn't it?
Yeah.
Old Tomes.
Old tomes. Yeah.
Yeah, so do send in any questions, and of course send in your comments. We're always pleased to get comments. I believe we've got something in on our last episode, the Tolkien episode.
Indeed we do. It was from John Harvey, and it says, wonderful conversation, especially the deeper consideration of Smeagol and parallels to World War I. So thanks for that, John.
Yeah, thanks for that sending in. I think it would have been nice to spend more time. Perhaps that's a subject we'll return to, because obviously there's a lot to dig into with Tolkien. In fact, we're not able to look at Dagon Sack today because, as you can imagine, this time of year, Dagon Sack is in high demand. Yeah, I think it's actually hanging from the Christmas tree in the town square. Well, I think that's what it is.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
It's not accessible.
No.
Slightly inaccessible at the moment. I know we have got a question in there about the connections between Tolkien and Lovecraft, so that's something we'll look at next time. And just looking ahead to next year, you'll be pleased to know we've got lots of great things lined up. We've already got some great guests lined up, and of course we'll be continuing with our reviews and chats of all things Lovecraftian and weird. I think we're going to be looking at Dagon, the film, which we're long overdue to look at.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and various other things. But do let us know what you'd like us to cover as well. So thanks again for joining us today, folks. It's time to board the bus and get back to the sanity of the real world. And we'd like to wish you all a happy Christmas, however you celebrate it. I hope you get time to spend with friends and families, and all the best for 2023. And with that, it's goodbye from me, Rob Poyton.
And it's goodbye from me, Tim Mendes.